Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, we are going to be talking about IELTS writing. This is our first lecture in the writing series, so let's get to it. So, there's actually two writing tasks. There's task one, which is academic writing, and task two, which is writing, two different writing tasks. We're going to be going over all of them, or sorry, I guess I should say both of them in this course. Today's lecture and also next day's lecture are going to be about task one, academic writing. And then there's another two lectures on the writing part. Most people tend to find the writing part a bit more complex and more difficult than the academic writing part, but it does just depend on you. I will go into more detail in our latter two course videos about task two, but this video and the next lecture video are just going to focus on task one. So I'm going to talk about what is task one exactly. So this lesson will cover how to talk about increases and decreases, how to identify what we should write about for our task one, how to use correct spelling and grammar. I won't go as much into detail with correct spelling and grammar because we do have an entire course for our grammar, but I will discuss this briefly and a little bit throughout as well. I will also talk about how to talk about trends and also the 5 steps to completing the IELTS task one with a line graph. So I want to actually talk a bit about what is IELTS task one. Basically, they give you some sort of a graph or a table or a chart, something like that, that you're going to look at. And then you're going to talk about the trends that you notice there. And I'll talk more about structure for that and how to do that in a little bit. This lesson, we're going to talk about line graphs. The next one, we're going to do bar graphs. I wanted to give some variety here of what different things could pop up. However, the structure of how you'll structure your answers, whether it's a line graph, a bar graph, or some sort of other diagram, it's the same across the board. But I did want to give, the only reason I'm doing both really is because I do want to give a little bit of variety here and show a couple different possibilities here. Okay, so let's talk about synonyms for up and down, right? Because we don't always just want to say up or down. One of the things that they're grading us on is how good our vocabulary is, right? Are we using good, appropriate words that make sense? So here are some synonyms for up: increase, rise, skyrocket, peak, jump, incline, surge, growth, to show an upward trend. So let's talk about what these mean because these are all synonyms for up, but they don't have exactly the same meaning. So I'm going to go into more detail as to what they mean exactly. So let's talk about increase. So increase just means goes up, right? It's a pretty basic one. And same with rise, right? Something could increase quickly or increase slowly. Same with rise. Something could increase quickly or rise quickly, right? Those are possible. So, rise and increase are very similar words in terms of how we would use them, and we will use them both um, when it comes to, we'll use them both in a very similar way a lot of the time. They're just words that mean to go up, right? The next one is skyrocket. So skyrocket means to go up, but skyrocket specifically is referring to going up really, really quickly, right? Think of a skyrocket. Rockets go up really fast, right? So if something is going up quickly, we could say it skyrocketed or it skyrockets at this part or something like that. If something is going up slowly, skyrocket would not be a good synonym to use. So keep that in mind. For example, we could say that housing prices in Ontario skyrocketed in 2022, right? Or they peaked at 2022 would be another way to say it. So, what do we mean by peak? Peak has different definitions, but in terms of the definition that we care about today, what I mean by peak is that it went up to its highest point for a while and then started coming down again, right? So, for example, right now in 2023, housing prices in Ontario have gone down from where they were last year in 2022, right? So that means they peaked in 2022. They were the highest they were for a while, and now they're a bit down from where they are in 2022, right? That's where they peaked, okay? So that's what we mean by peak. So again, that's why it's important to go through these words individually to understand what they exactly mean rather than just randomly choosing one of these words and thinking, oh, it means up and leaving it at that, right? Because if something's increasing slowly and you say, oh, it skyrocketed, well, that's not accurate. Or if you say, oh, it peaked when this is just a time it's going up, it's like, well, no, peak means that that's where it stops going up and starts going down. It's a turning point, right? Jump. What does jump mean? Well, jump means, like, let's say it was down here and then it jumps up to up here, right? It jumped. It did a jump, right? So a sudden increase would be the same as jump. Okay, what about incline? Incline's an interesting one. Actually, we'll circle back to that one in a minute because I want to talk about surge, just because surge is very similar to jump. So surge is a sudden, powerful forward or upward movement, right? So a very quick upward movement, like a jump, right? So it's very similar to a jump, and that's why I wanted to just talk about that one first. What about incline? Right? So incline is where we're going up, but at a relatively constant rate, right? So we're not doing a big jump or growing really fast or really slow. We're just going at some constant or relatively constant rate. We're inclining, right? So, for example, this is also a word often used in math to talk about, oh, an inclined surface or an inclined plane, right? Because it has a specific slope, right? The next one is growth. So, growth could be fast growth or slow growth. Growth does always mean we're going up, but this one's similar to increase and rise in that something could have slow growth or fast growth, or maybe just constant growth, right? All of those are possible. It doesn't necessarily talk about how fast or slow the growth is. And then to show an upwards trend or an upward trend. That's very similar to growth, increase, and rise as well, because something could show an upward trend in a slow manner or a fast manner or an exponential manner or logarithmic manner, any way, right? Any way that is possible, right? So there we go. So I hope that that shows you guys why it's important when we're looking at synonyms to not just write down a list of synonyms for everything and just use them interchangeably, but to actually go through and understand the specific meanings, right? It's like the word small, for example, and the word microscopic. You could argue small and microscopic, those are synonyms. However, we can't just, replace every time we see small with microscopic, right? Microscopic means so small we can't see it, right? Something could be very small, right? I caught a small fish earlier today. It was very little. It was a size that it could go in a fish tank, but it was not microscopic. We could certainly see it quite easily, as a matter of fact, right? So that's another example where just because something's a synonym doesn't mean we can just use it interchangeably. So something to keep in mind, right? We can't just use synonyms interchangeably all the time. Okay, let's talk about down. So let's start with plummet. Plummet means to fall or drop straight down at a high speed, right? So plummet means we're going down quickly, right? At a high speed, something's plummeting, right? So for example, let's say the stock market crashes and all the stocks just come plummeting down, right? So that means they come down very quickly, right? So again, this one isn't one we could just use for decreasing in general. This one is specifically plummeting, going down at a fast rate, right? Very fast. What about decrease and fall? These are similar words, right? Kind of like increase and rise. Decrease and fall are kind of their counterparts, so to speak. They're antonym counterparts, right? Something could be decreasing slowly or falling slowly. Something could be decreasing quickly or falling quickly, right? Something could be plummeting, right? Which means decreasing or falling very, very quickly, right? That's possible. The next one is decline. Now, decline has different meanings to it, but decline means that something's going down at a relatively constant rate, right? It's on a regular basis kind of declining, right? If something is declining, that doesn't mean it plummeted and went down super fast, but over time it is declining, it's going down. What about dip? Dip. Dip kind of means that something was, constant or going up, and then it dips. It goes down a little bit, right? Similar to drop, right? Drop also means, oh, it dropped down, it went down a little bit, right? To show a downward trend, that's also similar to decrease and fall as well, in the sense that something could show a downward trend quickly or slowly, right? That's possible. Now, what about plunge? So, a plunge means, if we think about what a plunge means in terms of water, right? We could talk about, oh, I plunged into the water, I jumped, or I dove really quickly and energetically, right? So the meaning is similar when we're talking about plunge in terms of going down, right? It means that we're falling drastically. A plunge is a drastic fall, kind of like a plummet, right? We're going down quickly, or same with a dive, right? If you think about a dive is going way down, right? A dive implies that we're going down more than a dip or a drop. We're going down quickly. We're going down fast, right? Something takes a dive, right? It goes down. So there we go. There's some synonyms. And if you have other synonyms for up and down, fantastic. I encourage you to use these where appropriate. I encourage you to look up other synonyms for up and down and other common things that you're going to be seeing in trends as well. But do make sure that you don't just write down a bunch of synonyms and use them interchangeably for other words. Make sure you know the exact meaning of that synonym, right? Because even though synonyms are words that have similar meanings, they're not words that have the exact same meaning. Otherwise, there wouldn't really be much point, you could argue, in having all these words that mean the exact same thing, right? But that's okay because that's not what synonyms are. Synonyms just have somewhat similar meanings to other words, right? And also, that's not to say we can never use up or down in our work, right? I think it's fine to use just basic words like up and down as well. But if those are the only words we ever use, and we don't use other words that are more descriptive to describe the trends that we're looking at, then we're not going to get top marks, right? Part of the marking of this section is, did we use our vocabulary well? Did we use vocabulary words that were descriptive and that made good sense? Or did we just kind of stick with very basic words and not really bother to learn any words other than up or down? Right. So that's something they are looking at. So do make sure to use some of these words. I don't expect, and I'm sure they don't expect you to use all of these words, but try and use a couple from each list every time. Okay. Let's do some filling in the blanks just to kind of get used to using these words. Temperature usually blank in February. Well, let's think of a few different words we could put here. We could say temperature usually decreases in February, right? At least in the Northern Hemisphere, February is a pretty cold month. So generally, temperature usually decreases in February. We could say temperature usually falls in February. We could say temperature usually dips in February. We could say temperature usually drops in February. I wouldn't say temperature declines in February because it's not necessarily going at a relatively constant rate. It's just kind of, it goes down overall. I also wouldn't say it plummets in February because it's not like January is summertime and then it plummets. It goes down really fast. Well, no, January is pretty cold too. So I wouldn't say that temperature usually plummets or plunges or dives in February, but I would say it drops. I would say it decreases. I would say it falls, right? Absolutely. Okay. Number two is house prices blank in 2022. So in Ontario, housing prices peaked in 2022. So that would be my first answer, is they peaked, right? Because they went up throughout the middle of 2022 and then they started to go down again, right? So they rose and fall, and they rose and they fell, right? They peaked in 2022. We could also say, if we're talking just about the first half of 2022, we could say they skyrocketed in 2022 because they did go up by higher percentages compared to what we're used to, right? So that's a big one, for sure, right? What's another one we could say? Well, depends. Maybe there's a different place where the housing prices did not increase in 2022. Maybe there's a place where the house prices went down. Well, if they went down a lot in 2022 in a certain place, we could say they plummeted, right? If they went down, just kind of dipped slightly, went down a little bit, we could say house prices dipped in 2022, right? We could say they decreased or they fell in 2022 in that case as well, right? So it just depends where we're talking about exactly. I assume we're talking about Ontario and a lot of other places. House prices did increase and or even skyrocket in some cases in 2022. So I assume that's what this is referring to. Okay. The cost of housing in Toronto has blank over the last 10 years. Well, let me tell you. So the housing prices right now in Toronto, both to buy or rent, are a lot larger today, are a lot higher prices today than it cost 10 years ago. There's television shows from of Toronto, 10 years ago, and there's apartments and other places to rent and buy that cost a fraction of what they do today. So over the last 10 years, the housing prices, clearly the cost of housing in Toronto and most other places for that matter, have increased. So I would say the cost of housing in Toronto has increased over the past 10 years. Now, would I say it has skyrocketed over the past 10 years? Because I did mention that it went up a lot. So would skyrocket make sense here? Well, that's an interesting question. I would say probably I probably wouldn't say that because it's 10 years is a long time. So yes, it's increased a lot, but it's also a long time, right? If housing prices did a huge jump, or a huge skyrocket in just a year or two, I might use skyrocketed. But I hesitate to use that because 10 years is a long time and a lot can change in 10 years in general. So I would say some better words here might be increase or rise, right? The cost of housing in Toronto increased over the last 10 years. The cost of housing in Toronto has risen in the last 10 years or rose in the last 10 years. Or the cost of housing in Toronto has grew over the last 10 years, right? I know grew isn't one of the words here, but growth is, and grew is similar to growth, right? So that's one. I also might not use surge or jump for the same reason I probably wouldn't use skyrocket here. I think I would be more likely to just say increased or went up, right? Okay. Number 4 says there was a blank in sales for many businesses in 2020. Well, I would say probably there was a drop in sales, is the first thing that comes to my mind, at least, for sales in 2020, right? For many businesses, right? Because of COVID, a lot of things were shut down in 2020, unfortunately. And so there was a drop in sales for many businesses in 2020. Not all businesses, right? But for many businesses, that was the case, right? Or we could say there was a decrease in sales. I think that makes sense as well. We could say there was a plunge in sales, even for many businesses in 2020, right? It was so jarring for some businesses that they had to shut down, they had to close their doors, they couldn't recover from it, right? So I think plunge or dive or something more, you know, something or plummet or some word like that would be appropriate, right? I think that would be an appropriate word to use here, that there was a plummet, right? Where that sales, or I guess the better way to say that would be the sales plummeted for many businesses in 2020. So perhaps plummet for grammatical reasons doesn't make the most sense here, but I think you guys get what I'm trying to say here, right? Okay. Number 5. Every year there is a or an blank in college and university applications across the board. I would say probably increase makes the most sense for me here. There is an increase in college and university applications across the board, or a rise or a growth, something like that. I probably wouldn't necessarily say a skyrocket, right? Because it's not like one year there's going to be 10,000 and the next year there's like 30,000. It's not like a skyrocket per se, but there certainly is a gradual increase of university and college applications across the board. So I think an increase or there are rising applications would be a fair thing to say there. And then number six, in 2020, there was a blank demand for delivery services. Well, I would say there's an increased demand for delivery services in 2020. Again, because of the pandemic, people not being able to leave their homes and go to places, people preferred to have things just delivered to their door. And so that's what a lot of people did. And Amazon was very successful. They were successful before, but they were especially successful in 2020. That's for sure. That's very much for sure. So there was an increased demand for those delivery services in 2020. What else could we say? We could say there was a rising demand. We could say, I don't know if I'd say skyrocketing demand because it's not like Amazon had barely any sales before and then, 2020 hit and suddenly they're successful. No, they were always successful. They were just extra successful in 2020, right? They just grew even more, right? We could say there was a jump, right? There was a jump in the demand for the delivery services that we could say, right? Perhaps there's people who usually didn't do delivery services or didn't use delivery services rather before, but then started to because of the pandemic, right? That's possible. So there could have been a jump with many new customers in 2020. So that could make sense. So, yeah. So there you go. There you go. There's some different ways to fill in these blanks. And something I want to stress is that there's not just one answer for each of these, right? There's many answers that make sense, but then there's also answers that aren't necessarily entirely wrong, but that make a bit less sense, right? So for example, to say the cost of housing in Toronto has skyrocketed over the last 10 years, I don't think that's as strong an answer as just saying that it increased, right? Because skyrocket is increased really fast in a really short amount of time. Well, 10 years is not a very short amount of time. I wouldn't have said it. It's not a super long time, but it's also not a super short time either. It's a lot of time, right? Um, so there you go. And there's also some words that we have to kind of change the form of to make them make grammatical sense, right? There's other words that just don't really make grammatical sense without adding a couple other words, things like that. So do keep that in mind too, and make sure that the sentences you're creating do make grammatical sense. That's very important as well, and that is something you're graded on in this. Okay, so now we're actually going to take a look at an example. This is from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, okay? And this is a chart where it shows the average annual expenditures on cell phone and residential phone services from 2001 to 2010. And basically, our task, this is task one, by the way. This is an example of something you could get for task one. The how we're going to write about this trend, we first must paraphrase, then identify the trend, then identify three specific trends, and then check our spelling and grammar and structure. Okay. So there we go. So let's take a look at this. And let's talk about too, what do I mean by paraphrase? Paraphrase means to state in a sentence or two what is the trend, what's going on with this trend, what's going on with this graph. So what does the graph show? Well, this graph shows the average annual expenditures on cell phones and residential phone services from 2001 to 2010. Now, one thing I want to mention is we don't just want to copy what's already here. We want to use some of the same wording, perhaps, right? And we want to say something with the same meaning, but we don't want to just copy what's here. Okay. We're not going to get a lot of points from just copying down what's here. Okay. They don't care if we can copy. They care if we can paraphrase this. Can we talk about what this chart is showing us in our own words? So, one example for paraphrasing is we could say, in this case, the graph shows the average yearly spending on both mobile and landline phones in the United States over a 10-year period from 2001 to 2010, right? So there we go. It shows, we talked about what it shows. It shows the average yearly spending. And also, we mentioned that it's both mobile phones and landline phones. We also said in the United States because the source here is the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so we know that it's United States data. This is specifically talking about people who live in the United States. And it's over a 10-year period from 2001 to 2010. Now, notice this says essentially the same thing as this does, right? They say essentially the same thing, but I worded it differently. I didn't just copy it down. And I also use some synonyms, right? I use cell phone because that's pretty much, that's what we call these things. We call them cell phones, right? And then it said residential phone services. People also call residential phone services landlines, right? So over here I said landline phones, right? So landline phones are less common today. I don't know how many people still have them. I've never had a landline phone personally. I just have a cell phone. But back in the earlier days, it was a lot more common for people to have landline phones, right? That was a common thing that people would have and that they would pay for back in the early years. And this graph shows that, right? This graph shows that in 2001, people were spending a lot more on residential phone services or landline phones than they were in cell phones. Then looks like in 2006 is where it kind of crosses. It seems like the average household is spending about the same on landline phones as they are on cell phone services. And then after 2006, seems like people are spending more money on their cell phone services and less on residential phone services, right? Perhaps there's people who, now that they have cell phones, a cell phone service that can do more than their landline could. A lot of people are getting rid of their landlines, or a lot of people are deciding to go with less costly or not cell phone plans, less costly residential phone service plans, right? Less costly landline plans, because landlines aren't as crucial to them as they used to be, right? And so that's what we can kind of see with this data. Okay, but yeah, but anyway, we paraphrased it. We talked about what does this graph show. We answered that question. We said that it shows the average yearly spending on both mobile and landline phones in the United States over a 10-year period from 2001 to 2010. Okay, next we need to identify the main trend. Okay, so we need to look at the graph and decide what the main point of it is. What is the main key message that we can learn about the average cost of mobile phones and landlines by looking at this graph? So let's go back. What's the main thing here that you notice right away? The main thing, and there could be, your answer could be different from mine, and that is okay. As long as it's a true thing that you see first that represents the data overall, you're good to go. But the main thing I notice is that over the 10-year period, people are spending more and more money on cell phone services, but less and less money on residential phone services. That's the biggest thing I notice, right? Like in 2001 over here, looks like people are spending a lot more on residential phones, but by 2010, it's the opposite is true. People are spending a lot more on cell phones, right? And this is pretty gradual. It didn't, kind of go up and down, up and down, up and down. It seems like every year we're spending more than the previous year on cell phones, and every year we're spending less money than the previous year on residential phones overall. So this isn't just, it starts and ends this way. It's consistent like that. Consistently goes up and consistently goes down, respectively, right? Throughout these 10 years. So if we go back here, we can see that the overall trend is that the overall spending of landlines decreased throughout the decade, and the overall spending of cell phones increased throughout the decade. By the way, one thing I do want to address quickly, what do I mean by decade? Decade is another word for 10-year period. So you could say 10-year period, or you could say increased from 2001 to 2010. Any of those are good, relevant words. But I did want to give an opportunity to introduce this new word to you guys, which is decade, which is just means 10-year period, is what a decade is. Okay. Or people also define like, oh, your 20s, that's a decade, right? From the time you're 20 to 29, decade, 10 years. Or when you're 30 to 39, that's a decade, right? Okay. Next one is to identify 3 specific trends, okay? So there's lots of different things we could put here. I want to talk about what I said here and how it relates to the graph. So I said before 2006, the average household would spend more money on landlines than they did on cell phone services. After 2006, the average household would spend more money on their cell phone services than they did on their landlines. During 2006, the average household spent about the same amount of money on both landlines and cell phone services. So that's one specific trend we can look at. And if we go back to our graph, we'll see that that's true. Right, we'll see that over here, the light green line is above the dark green line, which means that residential phone services are costing Americans more money during these years than cell phone services are, or that the Americans are choosing to spend more on the residential services than the cell phone services. Whatever way you'd like to look at it, either way is fine. And then past 2006, right past this point, we have the dark green line is greater than the light green line, because the dark green line in this situation is the cell phone services, right? And the light green line is the residential phone services. So what does that suggest to us? Well, that suggests to us that that the cell phone services are costing Americans more than residential phone services, right? Or in other words, Americans are choosing to spend more money on their cell phone services than they are on their residential phone services from 2006 to 2010. And then in the middle here in 2006, looks like the lines are about at the same point. This is where they cross. So they're spending about the same regardless, right? For both, for residential and cell phone services. So that's good. That's good. So that looks like an accurate trend. So the key things to remember here, the key things to make your answer good are, make first of all, number one, make sure that what you're saying is accurate. Make sure it relates to the graph, because if you say something that does not actually relate to the graph, or that is related to the graph topic but that doesn't actually accurately represent what the graph is showing you, that's not good. Make sure it actually relates to the graph, and make sure that it also actually shows is saying what the graph is showing accurately. Okay, so for example, if I said that before 2006 the average household spent more money on cell phone services, well, that wouldn't be correct. The graph didn't show that. The graph showed the opposite was true, right? The second thing is make sure that you're using good, proper vocabulary, right? So the average household, good vocabulary. We talked about landlines, we talked about cell phone services. You could also use residential phones, or you could say home phone instead of landline. Either way is fine, as long as we're using good, proper language. And then last but not least, also make sure that you're using proper spelling and grammar. So remembering commas, periods, any other spelling and grammar that's there. If you aren't sure how to spell something, you could change it to a different word that is a synonym that's going to make sense, is one option. If the word it was actually said earlier on the chart, copy it from there. That also works as well. That's a good way to make sure that the spelling is good and it's correct. Okay, what's another specific trend? It says the average money spent on cell phone services was less than $200, but increased to over $800 by 2010. Actually, I might change this a little bit. I should change this before I upload this. It says less than $200. It should say less than $200 in 2001, but increased to over $800 by 2010. So is that accurate? Well, yes, it is, right? If we look here, it's about $200 right here, and then here it's about $800. Actually, this one, it's not entirely accurate because it's still under $800. We could say over $700 or close to 800 or close to 200, but this is not over 800, right? 800 is all the way up here. This is down here. So actually this one I would change slightly, because it is not over 800 by 2010. It is close to 800 by 2010. And it was not less than 200. It was just over 200, but around 200, we could say, right? So that one I think I should change up a little bit. I don't agree with that statement. Let's move on to this next one, though. It says expenditures on home phone services began at about $700 and gradually decreased to almost half of the original at amount at about $400. Both services reached a plateau between 2007 and 2008. So let's see and make sure that's accurate. Let's see how this relates to the graph. So It says they began at about 700 and decreased to about 400. So let's see, is that accurate? Well, yes, they started at about 700, not exactly 700, looks like a little bit less per year than $700, but about 700 is fine. And then it says they decreased to about 400, and I would say that's accurate. They did decrease to about 400. So I think that's fine. Awesome. Because on these graphs, you can't really tell exactly what the numbers are. If I asked you, what's this number? You'd probably say, well, probably maybe about $690, right? It's much closer to 700 than 600. So maybe about 680 or 690, but we can't tell exactly, right? The point of this isn't to necessarily give exact numbers and, look and get that fraction exactly accurate. It's about noticing specific trends and being able to talk about overall trends and the big picture and overall what's happening here. What can we say about this graph? Alrighty. Awesome. So there's example one. Let's move on to example two. Okay. Oh, and actually, before we do that, sorry, before we move on to example two, let's review our task should have an introduction, right? Our introduction is basically us paraphrasing what the graph is about, should introduce the topic, and then an overview of the main ideas, and then a paragraph about each specific trend. Making sure there's at least two specific trends there is going to be key. We want to talk about more than just one trend. Okay, then we also, another tip is make sure you check that your values have the correct units. So are we talking about dollars, which in this case we are? Are we talking about pounds, which is a currency used in parts of Europe? Or pounds also is a weight as well. So either one, kilograms, a weight, etc. So what values do we have, and are we using the correct units? Also check that you're using the correct tense, right? If we're talking about things that happened in the past, what will we use, right? We use our past tense. If we're talking about things current events or predictions for the future, we would use present tense or future tense, right? So making sure we're using the correct tense. Also, check that your spelling is correct, especially for words that are used on the graph, right? Because if there's words that are already there, already given to you, make sure that they're written the same way that they are when they're given to you as well, because that's free points right there to just not get those wrong. And then also check that you use synonyms where possible and you didn't just always copy the same wording as the graph, right? If you sometimes use the same wording as the graph, that's fine, but they also want to check your vocabulary and check that you're using different words, right? So that's very important. Good. All right. So here is a sample answer that we could say for this. The line graph presents the average American phone users. Oh no, it should say what the line graph presents what the average American phone users spent annually on mobile and landline phone services over a 10-year period. Overall, there was a drastic decline on their spending on domestic residential phone lines because of the steady and rising popularity of mobile phones during this time period. A notable feature is that both services crossed paths in 2006, and while residential lines continued to decline, cell phones kept gaining more customers. Spending on cell phone services started at a mere $200 in 2001, while the annual expenditure on the residential phone services was about $700 in the same year. Over the next half decade, customers spent less on landline phones, bringing the amount down to below 600, while they spent up to $500. In 2006, cell phones overtook landline phones. Both services were equally popular and customers spent about $550 annually. In 2010, there was a dramatic rise in cell phone expenses of up to $750, making nearly a fourfold jump compared to its initial figure in 2001. In the meantime, the annual expenditure on residential phones services plummeted in 2007 and steadily decreased for the rest of the time period, right? So let's take a look at 2007. Let's head there. Yeah, so it looks like from 2006 to 2007 they plummeted, right? They went down by a lot, and then they go down a bit slower, more gradually. So that's why plummet was used in this situation. They went down faster, they plummeted, and then they decreased gradually, right? So that's that wording used there. And so the reason this is a great sample answer here is because not only is the spelling and grammar correct, but notice they used a lot of really good vocabulary, and also they accurately explained what was happening in the graph. And that's the biggest thing here is did they did they accurately describe that, right? So that's very important. Okay, so let's move on to another example. This is an example for where the source is Ellis B. Mercedes, Florida Real Estate. So basically, this looks at South Florida average sale price in houses and condos. So the green line is houses, and the red line is condos. And this looks like they look at it at a few different points at January of 2011, then June of 2011, then November, then April of 2012, then September, then February. So, what does this have in common? Well, let's see. How many months are there between January and June? Let's see. February, March, April, May, June. 5 months. Okay. And then July, August, September, October, November. Another 5 months. December, January, February, March, April, another 5 months. So it looks like they started January 2011 and they do it every 5 months. They check in to see what is the average home or condo price in this area, right? And so that's what we're looking at here. Right. So what could we say about this graph? I didn't actually write out a full thing for this one. But I am going to talk a bit about what we could say. So, what could we say? Let's just kind of brainstorm some ideas here. What could we say for the paraphrase section of this? Well, we could say that this graph shows the average Florida real estate prices for Southern Florida for both houses and condos from January 2011 until January of 2021 and checks in every 5 months, right? We could say something like that about this. So that's good. Okay, then what can we say is the main trend? Well, there's a couple things we could see as the main trend. We could say that both houses and condos increased in value over time, right? If we look at condos, they start with being about maybe $125,000 on average in January 2011. And then by January of 2021, they're almost at $500,000. They're just shy of that $500,000 mark over the 10 years, right? So we could say that. And then same with houses. Houses started at about $250,000 average sale price in Southern Florida. And then in January of 2021, now they're at $950,000, right? So just $50,000 less than $1 million for the average house in January 2021, right? And so clearly for both, whether it's houses or condos, real estate prices in Southern Florida increased over time. So that's one big trend we see. Another thing we see is that house prices are always greater than condo prices, right? The green line is always above the red line. And so it seems like there has never been a time in this 10-year period where the price of the average house in Southern Florida has cost less money than the average condo in Florida, right? Which makes sense. We know that generally condos go for less than houses, and especially if we're comparing in the same area, this is going to happen, right? This is going to happen. And then another specific trend we could look at is that at around the August 2020 mark, or maybe the March 2020, things look relatively even, right? Things kind of go up a little bit and then up a little bit, and then looks like they skyrocket for both houses and condos, but especially for houses, right? If we look at someone who bought in March of 2020, they would have paid for the average house $550,000 for the average house. And then that same house, really just a couple of years later, is now worth $950,000 potentially, right? Or whatever the average house is at the time. That's insane, right? It skyrockets right here at the end, whereas for the rest of this time, it just goes up gradually, right? And same with here. If we look at where we're at March 2020, we're at around just over the $300,000 mark, and then we skyrocket up to $500,000 for the average house price in January of 2021. So we didn't skyrocket as much, but that's still a pretty big, notable increase, right? Imagine buying a home and in March of 2020 here, and then less than a year later, you can now sell it for $500,000. That's insane, right? Normally, when we sell after a year, it might have gone up, it might have gone down, and also with real estate fees, it's not usually worth selling after a year for the most part, right? So that's insane, right? That's huge. So that's another specific trend that we could talk about is what happens at the end. And the reason I'm choosing at the end as opposed to a different part is because that's so notable, right? That's something else we could discuss here. So those are just, kind of brainstorming some ideas of what we could say for this. Of course, to, get full marks on this, it's not really about brainstorming. It is a writing task. So do make sure that you write down all of this, right? And go through all the parts that you need to go through in order to get this right, right? So make sure that you have an introduction, you have an overview of the main trends and the specific trends, and also that you check correct units, correct tenses, spelling and grammar, and also using synonyms where possible. Good. Now, that said, one thing I want to say about synonyms, don't use synonyms where it doesn't make sense. So, for example, with houses, don't say detached houses or semi detached, right? Because both of those are in the category of houses. So, if we just change it to one of those, we're changing the meaning, right? So, making sure that we're not using synonyms in a way that doesn't make sense, making sure we're only using synonyms where it does make sense, where it's not going to confuse our message. Okay. Here's another one. And the source for this one, actually, this is from the essentialielts.com website. This one is where we're looking at the number of computers sold and who sold them, right? We're looking at the number of computers sold from 2000 to 2005 by the Tech Guys, Computer Plus, and Laptop World. Okay, so here's another one. I'm not going to really go through and talk about this one. This one I leave to you, actually, as the person who is taking the IELTS to try on your own and to submit to me if you wish to do so. I mean, it's totally up to you if you want to do this and submit it to me, but I do strongly suggest it, and I will give you marks and feedback back to you on this. As well, if you do decide to go through this and submit this in, but do make sure to give it your best shot before submitting, right? Do really try and make sure your spelling and grammar is correct. Make sure that all of those things that we talked about that are necessary for this writing task example um, are there. And I know it says writing task 2 sample question. This is just the second sample question for task 1. This is all task 1. I want to be clear. We won't start talking about task 2 for a couple more lectures in, but there we go. There we go. There's another example. So the idea now, after hopefully after looking at this, now you know how to talk about increasing and decreasing trends using synonyms. You can also structure an IELTS writing piece about line graphs. You can also identify what should you write about and use the correct spelling, grammar, values. Oh, and it says and spelling in your writing. That's kind of redundant. We already said spelling up here, but apparently spelling is extra important today, regardless. But yeah, but anyways, good work today, everyone, and I will see everyone back for part 2. Part 2 is going to be is also going to be about this same writing task, but we're going to look at bar graphs instead of line graphs, so it'll be slightly different, but it is very much going over the same thing. As well, just a warning. And then lectures 3 and 4 are about writing task 2. So those are about a totally different writing task that's also on this test. So do make sure to come back for those, especially if today you felt like, okay, it's a good start, but you want some more examples, you want some more insight. That's exactly what you'll get out of the next day's lecture. So, yeah. So, regardless, good work today, and I hope to see everyone next day. Bye, everyone.